I'd like to thank the Gordon Moody charity for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all on this historic occasion. I understand that today is going to be split into the past, the present and the future for the charity. So if this is a Charles Dickens novel, I'm the ghost of Christmas past. You're probably wondering how I fit into the story. You'll have guessed from my accent I'm from London and therefore not to be trusted. But how did I possibly know Mr. Moody? Well, that's where I'm going to start. The first topic I want to talk about is that Mr. Moody was Mr. Moody. He was not Reverend Moody. He certainly wasn't Gordon. I've been fortunate to work around the world with a number of people, many of which thought they deserved respect. And I tend to reserve calling people Mr. or Mrs. for the people I really respect the most. Mr. Moody would never ask to be called Mr. He would never demand respect, and respect isn't something which can be demanded. It's something which has to be deserved. And in the case of Mr. Moody, it certainly was deserved. But back to my favourite subject of me. When I was born, we lived in Maidenhead, which is a beautiful town on the Thames, just outside of London. My father had come across from Italy, and we couldn't afford a house, so we lived in a fixed caravan estate. In order to make up for the variable nature of the income from my dad working as a waiter, my mother took work as a personal secretary to Mr. Moody. I don't know the exact dates. I'd guess she started to work for Mr. Moody just after the establishment of the Gordon Moody House in 1971, which we're celebrating here as the 50-year anniversary. Apparently, I'd be left in the pram while Mr. Moody would dictate stuff to my mum, who would use her short hand to write it down and then later type it up. I understand he would pace around the house, composing his speeches and letters. Mrs. Moody would therefore be left to look after me, and that's how we became a friend of the family. Mr. Moody was more than just an employer to us, to my mother. Despite my father being Italian and therefore Catholic, and my mum being Church of England, Mr. Moody insisted on carrying out my christening, although we had never before and would never again attend the church in question. I was told in adulthood that the driving force for all involved was the excuse to have the party and not to save my eternal soul. However, nevertheless, I stand here today as a Methodist purely because of Mr. Moody. In the early 80s, we moved away from Maidenhead, and I can only assume it was around this time that the Moodys moved down to Salcombe in Devon. This didn't spell the end of our family connection. Although doing better, we still weren't a wealthy family. And as such, the family holiday would be to drive down in our Fiat 500, one of the old sort, not the new trendy ones you see on the roads now, to Salcombe and stay at the Moody's for a week or two. Mr. Moody had a modest boat in the marina, and we would take this to East Portsmouth Beach. I never knew it was called that at the time. And Mr. Moody would help me build sandcastles to hold back the tide. This is the period from which I personally remember Mr. Moody, rather than stories from my mum and my dad. If you were to ask me now for a direct quote from Mr. Moody, I would tell you that their house was on the top of the hill, and after a long day playing in the sand, I would lag behind as we would walk back up the hill. And as we stand here in this beautiful venue, well done, Chloe, I can still hear his voice like it was yesterday. Quicken the pace, lengthen the stride, was the approach to be taken to the steepest parts. It was Mr. Moody's approach to all adversity. Don't retreat or try and find the easy way. Tackle the challenge head on. It's good advice, and probably why I remember it word for word. If you take nothing else from my speech today, then please take that. So whilst that quote was verbatim, the next is going to be more of a dramatisation. Indeed, at this point, I should say that my mum is no longer with us, so all I'm telling you today is based on my memories from over 30 years ago. So if you don't like anything you hear, then put it down to my faulty memory, and feel free to dismiss it as inaccurate. I mentioned earlier that Mr. Moody was always Mr. Moody, and not the Reverend Moody. I can only remember seeing him in a clerical collar, a dog collar, on 2 occasions. Now, as I said, whilst I remember the incident, I obviously don't remember exactly what was said. So this next bit is more Netflix The Crown than the History Channel. My dad was Italian, and as such, as my mum would say, had heavy feet. He drove too fast. We were driving in Mr. Moody's car. I think it was a large Rover. Mr. Moody was in the front, and I was in the back, and I was the first to see the excitement of the blue lights. My dad dutifully pulled over, and as he stopped, Mr. Moody asked me, "Be so good as to pass me the white collar from the back seat." You can see where this is going. The police officer appeared at my father's window, and his English isn't great, so it was Mr. Moody that spoke. "Good afternoon, young man, and how can I be of service to you?" The police officer peers into the car. "Oh, Reverend, you're a reverend." Yes. Well, you were driving a little fast." "Were we? Well, if you say we were, then surely we must have been. I do apologise. Thank you so much for letting us know." "Yes, Reverend. Well, you're welcome. Just try and drive a little slower." "That is excellent advice. My friend here certainly shall. Should we not also have some sort of ticket?" No, Reverend. That doesn't feel necessary. Just drive a little slower." As I said, I don't actually remember what was said, but I remember him putting on the dog collar, I remember him asking for the ticket, and I remember my father not getting one. The other time I remember him in clerical garb was when we were on their house on a Sunday, and Mr. Moody was going to give a service at the local church. He did not appear overly excited at the prospect. I will not risk inventing a dialogue for this one, but the gist was whilst worship had its place, for him he had things to do, actually helping people in the here and now. I can only assume in connection with this charity. And for him, that was the most important thing he could possibly be doing. I remember Mrs. Moody not being impressed with this excuse, and him being sent off to Sunday service. It's hard to see, but the message from both these stories is actually the same. The Mr. Moody that I remember was certainly a man of faith, but the priority for him was helping people. And the church was an important part of achieving that help, but the religion was the means, not the ends. I remind you again, these are memories of a child, and particularly at the time I've known nothing of religion, so therefore don't think I'm making any suggestion of the knowledge of Mr. Moody's faith. However, if you were to ask me about Mr. Moody, I would say he was a reverend, I would not say he was a reverend who devoted himself to helping people. I would say he was somebody who devoted himself to helping people who was a reverend. I hope I've expressed the difference. I'm conscious of time, and I believe there are other ghosts of Christmas past to come. So I'll fast forward now to the time at which I started university. It's the first of my family to attend, and I managed to get into a London university. It was an average university, in a beautiful part of London, with absolutely no parking. There was, however, a church almost adjacent to the campus who used a permit parking system as part of their running battle with the university over students using their car park. I wrote to the minister and offered £250, a lot of money in those days, for a parking permit. I was understandably ignored. I mentioned this to my mum, who mentioned it to Mr. Moody, who inquired with the minister as to how wealthy the parish must be to turn down a donation for student parking which was occurring in any event. By this point, Mr. Moody, I understand, was quite senior in the church, and the minister had only just been given his first parish. So a couple of days later, I found myself invited to his house, sitting in his parlour, with a freshly printed parking permit in my pocket, a cup of tea and saucer in one hand, and a slice of cake in the other, and there was no table for me to consume either of those. If you've been noticing the structure of my speech, you'll see it's a story, and it's followed by a moral. And no, the moral of this story is not to get double parked with a cup and saucer in one hand and a plate of cake in the other, or that may prove useful later on. As well as helping me, Mr. Moody's attitude was always that, although the church may not have asked for the student situation, while not taking the money, why not take the money and use it to further the work which the church was doing in the community? You may have noticed an inconsistency. I started pleading poverty, and in the last story I had both a car and a means to buy parking. The reason for this, I was a sponsored student and then went on to work for a prestigious city firm. This also doesn't really ring true. I wasn't going to Oxford or Cambridge. I had no family connections to get this kind of opportunity in life. What I did have was a personal letter of recommendation from the Reverend Gordon Moody, MBE. It was such a letter, as the partner of the firm said, They just had to see me. Mr. Moody would modestly say that he opened the door. It was for me to walk through it. I know there are people in this room, and I've spoken to some of them today, who have been helped by this charity. If Mr. Moody were here today, and you were to try to thank him for the work the charity has done in rebuilding your life, I suspect he would say the same thing to you. This charity didn't rebuild your life. You did that yourself, and you should be proud. What this charity has done is given you the safe environment and the support to do that. The charity opened the door. It was you that walked through it. And with that, my story is done. I'm sorry if I've disappointed. I've little knowledge of the work of the charity in the early days. The charity Mr. Moody would talk so passionately about was all about helping people. I knew it was something about gambling, but I never remember him being particularly anti-gambling. I certainly never remember him giving me a talk about gambling, warning me of its evils, as you might imagine. I do remember him talking to me about what it was to be a good person, to have compassion, and to leave a legacy to be proud of, and not just when people were looking. In fact, more so when people weren't looking. As I look around this room, I'm certain Mr. Moody will be very pleased to see all the people the charity has helped, and he would be honoured to have played a part in the work you continue to do. You should all be very proud. I'll now hand over to the next set of ghosts, and I'm certainly looking forward to hear about the great things the charity is doing today and has plans for the future. I'll be here all day. You've done me the courtesy of listening to my story. I'd be delighted to hear some of yours. Thank you.